The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William walked slowly through the private garden that had once been his mother's sanctuary. The roses were in full bloom, their sweet fragrance mixing with the crisp London air. He had come here seeking solace, as he often did when the weight of royal duties pressed heavily on his shoulders. Catherine found him there, standing motionless beside the memorial fountain dedicated to Princess Diana. His shoulders were tense, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose he adopted when deep in thought. She had been looking for him for over an hour, knowing instinctively that something was troubling him more than usual. "You've been avoiding the children's breakfast again," she said softly, approaching him with careful steps on the gravel path. Her voice carried the gentle concern of a wife who had learned to read her husband's moods like the changing seasons. William didn't turn around immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the dancing water of the fountain, where sunlight created tiny rainbows in the spray. "I received a call from the private secretary this morning," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's going to be another documentary about Mother. They want my cooperation." Catherine moved to stand beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but respecting the space he needed when memories of Diana overwhelmed him. She had witnessed these moments before, the way grief could suddenly grip him even after all these years. The loss of his mother when he was just 15 had left wounds that time had softened but never fully healed. "What kind of documentary?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. The media's fascination with Diana's story never seemed to end, each anniversary bringing new attempts to dissect her life, her marriage, her tragic death. "The same kind they always make," William replied, his jaw tightening. "They want to explore the untold story of her final months. They claim to have new footage, new interviews. They want me to sit down and share my memories, my feelings about losing her." The morning breeze rustled through the garden, carrying with it the scent of the white roses Diana had loved so much. Catherine watched a butterfly land delicately on one of the blooms, its wings catching the light as it searched for nectar. There was something peaceful about the moment. Despite the tension she could feel radiating from her husband. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," she said gently. "Your relationship with your mother's memory is yours to protect." William finally turned to look at her, and Catherine saw the conflict written clearly across his features. His blue eyes, so much like his mother's, were clouded with uncertainty. "But what if I should? What if staying silent means they get to control the narrative again? What if my children grow up believing the stories the tabloids tell instead of knowing who their grandmother really was?" It was a question that had haunted him for years. The balance between privacy and public duty, between protecting his family and honoring his mother's legacy. Catherine had watched him struggle with this tension countless times, seeing how it wore at him like water against stone. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his palm against hers. "Tell me what you're really afraid of," she said, using the voice she reserved for their most intimate conversations, the one that had always been able to reach him when nothing else could. William was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Around them, the garden hummed with life. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, birds called from the ancient oak trees, and, somewhere in the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls. "I'm afraid of getting it wrong," he admitted finally. "Every time I speak about her publicly, I worry that I'm not doing her justice, that I'm either sharing too much or too little, that I'm letting my own pain overshadow who she really was." Catherine squeezed his hand gently. She had never met Diana, but she had lived with her presence every day of her marriage. It was there in the way William spoke to their children, in his passion for the causes Diana had championed, in the way he sometimes got that distant look when certain songs played on the radio, or when he caught sight of a particular shade of blue. "She was George and Charlotte and Louis's grandmother," Catherine said quietly. "And they deserve to know her story from you, not from strangers with cameras and deadlines." The weight of that truth settled between them like morning mist. Their children were still young, but already they asked questions about the grandmother they would never meet. Catherine had seen how carefully William chose his words when they asked about Diana, how he tried to balance honesty with age-appropriate information. A palace staff member appeared at the far end of the garden path, hesitating when they saw the couple deep in conversation. Catherine gave a small shake of her head, and the person retreated quietly, understanding that this was not a moment to be interrupted. "What would she want?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. From everything William had told her about his mother, Diana had been someone who valued authenticity above all else, who had tried to use her position to make a real difference in people's lives. She would want the truth, William said without hesitation. Even if it was complicated, even if it was painful. She never liked the sanitized version of royal life. The butterfly that had been resting on the rose suddenly took flight, its bright wings carrying it higher and higher until it disappeared over the garden wall. Catherine watched it go, thinking about transformation, about the way beautiful things could emerge from periods of struggle and change. Then, maybe that's your answer, she said softly. Not what the documentary makers want, not what the palace advisors think is best, but what feels true to you and true to her memory. William nodded slowly, but Catherine could see that the decision was still far from made. The weight of public scrutiny, the pressure of royal protocol, the desire to protect his family's privacy, all of these forces pulled at him constantly. She had learned early in their relationship that being married to the future King of England meant sharing him with history, with duty, with the complex legacy of the monarchy itself. As they stood together in the garden where Diana had once walked, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of love and concern that defined so much of their marriage. She loved William's dedication to honoring his mother's memory, but she also worried about the toll it took on him, the way grief could ambush him when he least expected it. The morning was growing warmer, and soon they would need to return to the palace for the day's official engagements. But, for now, in this quiet sanctuary surrounded by roses and memories, Catherine simply held her husband's hand and let him feel whatever he needed to feel. Sometimes, she had learned, the greatest gift she could give him was simply her presence, her understanding, and the knowledge that whatever decision he made, she would be there to support him through it. 3 days had passed since that morning conversation in the garden, and Catherine could see the decision weighing heavily on William's mind. He moved through their daily routine with his usual grace and professionalism, attending meetings with foreign dignitaries, reviewing briefing papers, and playing with the children before bedtime. But she noticed the small signs that others missed. The way he lingered a moment too long over his morning coffee, the distant expression that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching, the restless energy that kept him pacing their private sitting room late into the evening. The call from the documentary production company had come again that afternoon while William was in meetings. Catherine had taken the message herself, speaking politely but firmly to the producer who seemed determined to secure an interview. The woman had emphasized how respectful and dignified their approach would be, how they wanted to honor Diana's legacy rather than sensationalize her story. Catherine had heard similar promises before, and she knew how quickly good intentions could be twisted by the pressures of ratings and deadlines. That evening, after the children had been put to bed with their usual routine of stories and gentle songs, Catherine found William in his study. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, and scattered across the leather-topped desk were photographs that she recognized from his private collection. Pictures of Diana laughing with her sons at various royal events, candid shots taken during family holidays, formal portraits from official engagements. It was as if he was trying to piece together a complete picture of who his mother had been, not just as a princess or a public figure, but as the woman who had raised him. The children were asking about her again tonight, Catherine said softly as she entered the room. She moved to the window and drew the heavy curtains against the London evening, creating an intimate cocoon of warmth and privacy. William looked up from a photograph of Diana pushing him on a swing at Highgrove, both of them captured in a moment of pure joy and laughter. What did you tell them? I told them that their grandmother was someone very special who loved children very much, and that she would have adored them beyond measure. Catherine settled into the comfortable chair across from his desk, tucking her legs beneath her in the casual way she only allowed herself in their most private moments. George asked if she would have taught him to play football the way you do. A smile tugged at the corners of William's mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness Catherine had seen from him in days. She probably would have. She was competitive about everything, even board games. Harry and I could never beat her at anything without her letting us win. The memory seemed to warm him, and Catherine felt some of the tension in her own shoulders begin to ease. These moments when William could speak about his mother with joy rather than grief were precious and rare. She had learned to cherish them, to encourage them without pushing too hard. She sounds like she was a wonderful mother, Catherine said, meaning every word. From everything she had heard from William, from Harry, from the people who had known Diana personally, it was clear that despite all the public scrutiny and personal struggles, Diana had been devoted to her sons above all else. She was, William said, his voice soft with remembrance. Not perfect, but wonderful. She made mistakes, had her own struggles, but she never let us doubt that we were the most important thing in her world. He picked up another photograph, this one showing Diana at a homeless shelter, crouched down to speak with a young child. Even in this simple snapshot, her compassion was evident in every line of her body, in the way she had made herself small to meet the child at eye level. That's what I want our children to know about her, William continued. Not the fairy tale princess story, not the tragic victim narrative, but the real woman who cared about people, who tried to make a difference, who loved fiercely and lived authentically even when it was difficult. Catherine nodded, understanding flooding through her. This was what William had been struggling with, she realized. Not whether to participate in the documentary, but how to ensure that his children and future generations would know the complete truth about Diana, not just the polished public version or the sensationalized media portrayal. Have you considered writing something yourself? She suggested gently. Not for a documentary or a tabloid, but something more permanent. Something that George and Charlotte and Louis could read when they're older, something that came directly from you. William set down the photograph and looked at her with sudden interest. You mean like a memoir? Not necessarily a whole book, Catherine clarified, though she could see the idea taking root in his mind. But maybe letters to them about their grandmother. Stories about what she was like as a mother, what she believed in, how she shaped who you became. Something private, something just for our family. The suggestion seemed to energize William in a way that Catherine hadn't seen since this whole documentary business had begun. He stood up and began pacing the room, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. I could tell them about the time she smuggled McDonald's into the palace because Harry was having a difficult day, he said, warming to the idea. Or how she used to dance around the kitchen while making breakfast, embarrassing us terribly, but making us laugh at the same time. Those are the stories that matter, Catherine agreed. The ones that show who she really was when the cameras weren't rolling. William stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression more animated than it had been in days. She would have loved this idea. She always said that the best gifts were the ones that came from the heart, not from duty or obligation. Catherine felt a surge of relief and something deeper, a sense that they had found the right path forward. She had been married to William long enough to know when an idea truly resonated with him, when something shifted from possibility to certainty in his mind. You could include photographs too, she suggested, gesturing to the collection spread across his desk. Not the official portraits, but the candid ones, the ones that show her personality. And I could write about her causes, the work she was passionate about, William added, his voice gaining strength and conviction. I want our children to understand that being royal isn't just about ceremonies and protocol. It's about using your position to help others, the way she did. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing easily as they discussed what such a collection of letters might include. William shared stories that Catherine had never heard before, memories that painted a picture of Diana as a loving but imperfect mother who had tried her best to give her sons as normal a childhood as possible despite their extraordinary circumstances. As the palace clocks chimed midnight, Catherine realized that something fundamental had shifted. The weight that had been pressing down on William's shoulders had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and direction. He no longer looked like a man trapped between competing demands, but like someone who had found a way to honor both his private grief and his public responsibilities. I'll call the production company tomorrow and decline their offer, William said as they prepared to leave the study. And then I'll start writing. Not for them, not for the public, but for George and Charlotte and Louis. So they'll know exactly who their grandmother was, in my own words. Catherine smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction at seeing her husband find his way through this emotional maze. As they turned off the lights and headed toward their bedroom, she caught sight of one last photograph on the desk, a family portrait taken just months before Diana's death. In it, Diana's arms were wrapped around both her sons, all three of them laughing at something outside the frame. It was a perfect encapsulation of the woman William wanted his children to know, not the people's princess or the tragic figure, but simply their grandmother, who had loved completely and lived fully in whatever time she had been given. 2 weeks had passed since William began writing his letters to the children about their grandmother, and Catherine could see a remarkable transformation in her husband. The cloud of uncertainty and grief that had shadowed him for months was beginning to lift, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Every morning after breakfast, he would disappear into his study for an hour or two, emerging with a lightness in his step that reminded Catherine of the man she had fallen in love with at university. The change hadn't gone unnoticed by the children either. George, with the perceptiveness that came with being the eldest, had asked Catherine why Papa seemed happier lately. Charlotte had simply declared that she liked it when Daddy smiled more at breakfast. Even little Louis seemed to sense the shift in household atmosphere, babbling more cheerfully during their family time, and reaching eagerly for his father during their evening play sessions. Catherine was in the private sitting room that afternoon, reviewing plans for an upcoming charity engagement, when William appeared in the doorway with a manila folder in his hands. His expression was both excited and nervous, like a student about to present an important project to a beloved teacher. "Would you like to read what I've written so far?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "I'd value your perspective before I continue." Catherine set aside her work immediately, understanding the significance of the moment. William rarely shared his deepest thoughts and feelings, even with her. The royal upbringing that had taught him to maintain composure in all circumstances sometimes made emotional intimacy challenging, though she had learned to read the subtle signs of his inner world. She opened the folder carefully, finding several handwritten pages in William's familiar script. The first letter was addressed to all three children, but she could see separate letters for each of them as well. William's handwriting, usually so precise and controlled, showed slight variations in pressure and spacing that revealed the emotion behind the words. "My dearest George, Charlotte, and Louis," the first letter began, "I want to tell you about your grandmother, Princess Diana, not as the world knew her, but as I knew her. She was my mother, and she would have been the most wonderful grandmother to all of you. She would have spoiled you terribly, played with you endlessly, and loved you with the fierce, protective love that only grandmothers possess." Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion as she continued reading. William had captured not just the facts of Diana's life, but the essence of who she had been as a person. He wrote about her laugh, which could fill an entire room with joy. He described her habit of humming while she worked, usually off-key, but always with such enthusiasm that it was impossible not to smile. He told stories about her competitive streak during family game nights, her insistence on fair play, and her talent for turning ordinary moments into adventures. "She once convinced the palace cook to let us help make pancakes for breakfast," Catherine read aloud, her voice soft with wonder. "We made such a mess that it took 3 staff members to clean the kitchen afterward, but she didn't care. She said that perfect kitchens were for perfect people, and perfect people were boring." William had been watching her face as she read, and now he leaned forward slightly. "Is it too sentimental? Too personal?" "It's perfect," Catherine replied without hesitation. "It's exactly what they need to know about her. You're not just telling them what she did, you're showing them who she was." She continued reading, finding herself drawn deeper into the world William was creating with his words. He wrote about Diana's charity work, but not in the distant, formal language of press releases. Instead, he described how she would come home from hospital visits and tell her sons about the children she had met, how she would remember their names months later and ask for updates on their conditions. He explained how she had taught him and Harry that their privileged position came with responsibilities, but also with incredible opportunities to make real differences in people's lives. "Your grandmother believed that kindness was the most important quality a person could possess," Catherine read from another passage. "She taught me that it didn't matter how many titles someone had or how much money they possessed. What mattered was how they treated others, especially those who were vulnerable or in need." The letters weren't just memories and anecdotes, Catherine realized. They were life lessons, values passed down from grandmother to grandchildren through the loving filter of their father's recollections. William was using his own experience of being raised by Diana to create a blueprint for how he wanted to raise his own children. One letter was specifically for Charlotte, and Catherine found herself particularly moved by its contents. William had written about Diana's efforts to show her sons that emotions were nothing to be ashamed of, that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. He described how Diana had encouraged him to cry when he was hurt or sad, how she had taught him that real strength came from facing difficult feelings rather than burying them. "I want you to know, my darling Charlotte," the letter continued, "that your grandmother would have taught you to be proud of your feelings, to trust your instincts, and to never let anyone convince you that being gentle or compassionate makes you weak. She would have shown you that the most powerful thing in the world is a kind heart guided by a strong mind. Catherine paused in her reading, overwhelmed by the beauty and wisdom of William's words. She looked up to find him studying her face anxiously, clearly worried about her emotional response. "These are incredible, William," she said, reaching for his hand. "They're not just letters, they're a gift. The most precious gift you could ever give to our children." Relief flooded William's features, and Catherine saw some of the last remaining tension leave his shoulders. "There's more I want to write," he said. "I want to tell them about her final years, about the challenges she faced, but in a way that helps them understand her choices without frightening them or making them angry." It was perhaps the most delicate part of Diana's story, Catherine knew. The divorce from Charles, the media scrutiny, the struggles with mental health, the tragic end in Paris. All of it would need to be addressed eventually, but with care and age-appropriate honesty. "They don't need to know everything at once," Catherine said gently. "You could write different versions of the more difficult stories, ones they can read as they get older and are better able to understand complex emotions and situations." William nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too. Maybe short versions for when they're young, and then more detailed accounts for when they're teenagers and adults." The afternoon sun was slanting through the sitting room windows, casting warm golden light across the pages in Catherine's lap. Outside, she could hear the sounds of palace life continuing its usual rhythm, but inside this room, time seemed suspended in a bubble of intimacy and purpose. "I think she would be very proud of what you're doing," Catherine said softly. "Creating something lasting and meaningful, something that comes from love rather than obligation." William was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered her words. "I hope so," he said finally. "I hope she would understand that this feels like the right way to share her story, not for the cameras or the newspapers, but for the people who matter most." As Catherine carefully placed the letters back in the folder, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had taken together over the past few weeks. What had started as a source of stress and conflict had transformed into something beautiful and healing. William had found a way to honor his mother's memory while protecting his family's privacy, and in doing so, he had given their children a priceless connection to the grandmother they would never meet, but would always carry in their hearts. That a month after William had begun his letters, Catherine found herself once again walking through Diana's memorial garden, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The garden that had once felt heavy with grief and unresolved questions now seemed lighter, more peaceful, as if the very act of putting memories into words had somehow lifted a weight from the space itself. William had asked her to meet him there after lunch, saying he had something important to share. She found him sitting on the stone bench near the fountain, not with the tense, withdrawn posture she remembered from that morning weeks ago, but relaxed and contemplative. In his hands was a leather-bound journal that she didn't recognize. "I finished the first collection," he said as she approached, his voice carrying a quiet pride. 23 letters in total. Stories, memories, lessons, everything I want them to know about their grandmother's heart and spirit. Catherine settled beside him on the bench, noting how the autumn air carried the scent of the last roses of the season. The garden was transitioning toward winter, but rather than feeling like an ending, it felt like a natural progression, a peaceful passage from one season to the next. "May I see?" she asked softly. William handed her the journal, and Catherine could immediately see the care that had gone into its creation. The leather binding was deep blue, Diana's favorite color, and the pages inside were thick cream paper that would last for generations. William's handwriting had evolved over the weeks of writing, becoming more flowing and confident as he had found his rhythm with the project. She opened to a random page and found herself reading a letter addressed to Louis, written for when he would be old enough to understand more complex ideas about service and duty. William had described how Diana had tried to balance her royal obligations with her desire to be a hands-on mother, how she had sometimes brought her sons along to charity events not as photo opportunities, but because she wanted them to understand the real impact of the work they were supporting. "She took Harry and me to visit a AIDS hospice when I was about 10, Catherine read aloud. It was considered controversial at the time, bringing children to meet people with such a stigmatized illness. But she wanted us to see that sick people were still people, that they deserved compassion and dignity, not fear or judgment. She held hands with the patients, hugged them, laughed with them. She showed us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone is simply your presence and your humanity." Catherine looked up from the journal to find William watching her with an expression of deep satisfaction. This isn't just about preserving memories, she realized aloud. You're passing down a philosophy of life, a way of understanding what it means to serve others. Exactly, William said, his voice warm with conviction. I want them to understand that being royal isn't about privilege or status. It's about responsibility. The same responsibility their grandmother felt, the same commitment to making a positive difference that drove everything she did. As Catherine continued to flip through the journal, she noticed that William had included small photographs throughout the letters, carefully selected images that illustrated the stories he was telling. There was Diana teaching a young William to ride a bicycle, her face alight with encouragement and joy. Another showed her reading bedtime stories to both boys, all three of them crowded together on a too-small chair, completely absorbed in the book. The children are going to treasure this, Catherine said, running her finger gently along the edge of a photo that showed Diana and William building sandcastles on a beach, both covered in sand and laughing. But, more than that, it's going to shape how they see themselves and their role in the world. William nodded, then looked toward the fountain where the water continued its gentle dance in the afternoon light. There's something else, he said. Something I realized while I was writing all of this. Catherine waited, sensing that whatever he was about to share was significant. I spent so many years feeling guilty, William said quietly. Guilty that I survived when she didn't. Guilty when I was happy, when I fell in love, when I achieved things she would never see. I felt like moving forward with my life somehow diminished her memory or meant that I was forgetting her. The admission hung in the air between them, and Catherine felt her heart ache for the young man who had carried such an impossible burden for so many years. She reached for his hand, offering the same steady support she had given him that morning in this same garden. But, writing these letters, William continued, telling these stories, remembering her as she really was rather than as the tragic figure the media created, it's helped me understand something important. The best way to honor her isn't to carry guilt or to live in the past. It's to live the kind of life she would have wanted for me, to be the kind of father she would have been proud of, to continue the work she started. Catherine squeezed his hand gently, understanding flooding through her. This project had been about more than preserving memories for their children. It had been a form of healing, a way for William to finally make peace with his mother's death and his own survival. She would want you to be happy, Catherine said softly. She would want you to live fully, to love completely, to find joy in everyday moments. That's what these letters show, isn't it? That she was someone who chose joy and love even in difficult circumstances. Yes, William agreed, his voice stronger now. And that's what I want to teach our children. Not just through these letters, but through how we live our lives together. I want them to see that we can honor the past while still embracing the present and the future. A gentle breeze stirred the remaining leaves on the trees around them, and Catherine noticed that new buds were already forming on some of the branches, preparing for the spring that was still months away. There was something hopeful about that sight, something that spoke to the endless cycle of renewal and growth that defined all life. The documentary people called again yesterday, William said, but his tone was matter-of-fact rather than troubled. I spoke to them myself this time. I thanked them for their interest, but I explained that I had found a different way to share my mother's story, one that felt more authentic to who she was and what she would have wanted. How did they respond? Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. They were disappointed, of course. They pressed a bid, offered more money, promised greater editorial control. But I felt completely clear about my decision. This journal, these letters, this is how her story should be told. Not for ratings or profit or public consumption, but for love, for family, for the next generation. As they sat together in the garden, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion, as if they had come full circle from that morning of uncertainty and pain to this afternoon of clarity and peace. William had found his way through the maze of grief and obligation to something pure and meaningful. He had found a way to honor both his mother's memory and his own family's needs. Will you show them to the children soon? She asked. William smiled, the first completely unguarded smile she had seen from him in months. I thought we might start with George. Read one letter together, maybe before Christmas. Let him ask questions, see how he responds. Then, gradually introduce Charlotte and Louis as they get older. The idea of sharing these precious words with their children felt like the natural next step in a journey that had begun with pain but had transformed into something beautiful and healing. Catherine could already imagine George's serious face as he listened to stories about the grandmother he had never met, could picture Charlotte's delight at learning about Diana's love of dancing and laughter, could envision Louis growing up with these stories as part of his understanding of where he came from and who he was meant to become. As they prepared to leave the garden, Catherine took one last look at the fountain where this whole journey had begun. The water continued its eternal dance, catching the light and throwing it back in 1,000 tiny sparkles. It struck her as the perfect metaphor for memory itself, something that flowed and changed but never stopped, something that could reflect light and beauty even in the midst of loss and sorrow. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed the grounds of Kensington Palace into a winter wonderland. The gardens that had played host to so many important conversations over the past months now lay peaceful under a blanket of pristine white, the fountain still and silent in its winter rest. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was warm with family traditions and the excitement of 3 children who could barely contain their anticipation for Christmas morning. Catherine was in the sitting room with Charlotte and Louis, helping them arrange the last few ornaments on the family Christmas tree, when William appeared in the doorway. He carried with him the blue leather journal, and Catherine immediately understood that this was the moment he had been preparing for. This was when the letters would begin their true purpose, connecting their children to the grandmother they had never met. George, William called softly to his eldest son, who was reading quietly in the corner. Would you come here for a moment? There's something special I'd like to share with you. George looked up with the serious expression that made him seem older than his years, his eyes moving curiously between his father and the journal. At 8 years old, he was beginning to understand that his family was different from others, that his future held responsibilities and challenges that most children would never face. But he was also still young enough to approach new experiences with wonder rather than worry. Is it about Granny Diana? George asked as he settled beside his father on the sofa. Catherine had to smile at his perceptiveness. The children had all been asking more questions about their grandmother lately, perhaps picking up on the subtle changes in their father's demeanor over the past months. Yes, it is, William replied, opening the journal to the first letter. I've written some stories about her, about what she was like when Uncle Harry and I were your age. Would you like to hear one? Charlotte immediately abandoned her ornament hanging and climbed onto William's other side, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. I want to hear too, Papa. Even Louis, who at 3 was too young to fully understand, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. He toddled over and settled himself on Catherine's lap, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as he prepared to listen to his father's voice. William cleared his throat and began to read the letter he had chosen for this first sharing, one that Catherine remembered as being particularly warm and accessible for young children. It told the story of a snowy Christmas Eve much like this one, when Diana had decided that the formal palace Christmas dinner was too stuffy for children. Instead, she had convinced the kitchen staff to help her create a living room picnic, complete with sandwiches cut into Christmas tree shapes and hot chocolate served in royal china teacups. Your grandmother believed that Christmas magic was more important than Christmas protocol, William read, his voice warm and engaging. She spread blankets on the floor of the grandest drawing room in Kensington Palace and declared it our Christmas Eve adventure. Harry spilled hot chocolate on a priceless Persian rug, but instead of being upset, she laughed and said it would make the rug more interesting. George listened with complete attention, his young face serious as he absorbed every detail. Catherine could see him trying to picture this woman he had never met, this grandmother who had been both a princess and someone who understood that children needed magic more than they needed perfection. Did she really let Uncle Harry spill chocolate on an expensive rug? Charlotte asked, her voice filled with delighted disbelief. She did, William confirmed, smiling at his daughter's reaction. And then, she helped him clean it up while telling him stories about all the other accidents that had happened in that room over the centuries. She had a way of making mistakes feel less scary and more like part of life's adventures. Catherine watched her family in this moment of connection across generations and felt her heart fill with a deep, quiet happiness. This was what William had been searching for all along, she realized. Not just a way to preserve Diana's memory, but a way to make her a living presence in their children's lives, someone who could continue to guide and influence them even though she was no longer physically present. The letter continued with more details about that long-ago Christmas Eve, describing how Diana had taught her sons to make paper snowflakes to hang in the windows, how she had sung Christmas carols in a voice that was more enthusiastic than melodic, how she had insisted on reading the Christmas story from the children's Bible rather than the formal version used in royal ceremonies. "She sounds like she was really fun," George said thoughtfully when William finished reading. "Like she knew how to be a grown-up and still remember what it was like to be a child." It was such an insightful observation from someone so young that Catherine felt a surge of pride in her eldest son. George had inherited not just his father's sense of responsibility, but his grandmother's intuitive understanding of what really mattered in life. "That's exactly right," William said, closing the journal gently. She never forgot that being important or having a title didn't mean you had to stop enjoying simple pleasures or caring about the feelings of others. Charlotte had been unusually quiet during the story, and now she looked up at her father with a question that Catherine could see had been building in her young mind. "Papa, do you think she would have liked us? Me and George and Louis?" The question clearly touched William deeply, and Catherine watched as he took a moment to compose his answer. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion but steady with conviction. "Oh, my darling girl," he said, pulling Charlotte closer to his side. "She would have absolutely adored all three of you. She would have spoiled you terribly and taught you to dance badly and taken you on secret adventures that would have given your protection officers heart attacks. She would have been the most wonderful, most loving, most fun grandmother any children could ever hope for." The snow continued to fall outside the windows, and the Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow over the family gathered together on the sofa. Catherine realized that this moment represented more than just the sharing of a story. It was the beginning of a tradition, a way of keeping Diana's presence alive in their home, and in their children's understanding of who they were and where they came from. "Will you read us more stories about her?" George asked, his voice hopeful. "Many more," William promised. "I have letters for each of you, stories about what she was like and what she believed in, things she would want you to know about living a good life and using your position to help others." As the evening progressed, and the children were eventually shepherded off to bed with dreams of Christmas morning dancing in their heads, Catherine and William found themselves alone in the sitting room with the journal resting on the table between them. The house was quiet now except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked, moving to sit closer to her husband. "About sharing her with them, I mean." William was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. When he spoke, his voice carried a peace that Catherine hadn't heard in years. "It feels right," he said simply. "It feels like she's part of our family again, not just a memory or a photograph, but a real presence who can continue to influence and guide our children. The letters aren't just about the past anymore. They're about the future, about the kind of people we want George and Charlotte and Louis to become." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, feeling the warmth and strength that had anchored her through all the challenges of their life together. Outside, London was settling into its Christmas Eve quiet, but inside this room, she felt the presence of something larger than just their immediate family. She felt the continuity of love that connected past and future, the bonds that death could not break and time could not diminish. "She would be so proud of you," Catherine whispered against William's shoulder. "Proud of the father you've become, proud of the way you've found to keep her love alive for our children." As they sat together in the quiet Christmas Eve peace, the journal between them like a bridge spanning the years, Catherine understood that they had accomplished something precious and lasting. They had found a way to honor the past while embracing the future, to acknowledge grief while choosing joy, to ensure that love would continue to flow from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain of stories, wisdom, and hope. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the memorial garden where this journey had begun, but inside the warmth of their home, Diana's spirit lived on in the voices that would tell her stories, the hearts that would carry her lessons, and the children who would grow up knowing they were loved not only by the parents they could see, but by a grandmother whose love transcended time itself.